Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. We have a real treat for you today. We have a whole panel of experts here that are going to talk to you about grant funding, which is a super exciting and fun topic, as you all probably know as you're here. How many of you all have never applied for a grant before? Okay, so everybody else has at least tried, maybe been successful, maybe not. So we'll talk to you about our trials and challenges that we've had as well, and hopefully you can learn from that. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Rebecca Cole. I'm a faculty member at the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, Maryland. So we're the military's medical school. We focus on getting our doctors ready to fight and go to war. So my grant journey has begun probably about 3 years. It took me about that long to be successful. So it takes a lot of persistence and perseverance, but totally worth it in the end. So I'll let the panel members introduce themselves. We can maybe start at that end. If you want to say your name, where you're from, and your favorite thing or not so favorite thing about grant funding, applying for grants.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ambrose Wong. I'm a health services researcher at Yale Emergency Medicine. Favorite thing about grant funding, or lack of favorite thing? I think probably finances. Building a budget and figuring out how to allocate funding, probably. Would be
That's your favorite or
least
not?
favorite.
Least favorite, okay.
That is also my least favorite. I'm Anne-Marie Cardell. I am an APD at Emory in Atlanta. I do med ed. Where I get excited with grant writing is making that argument for something I'm passionate about. I feel like it's a puzzle. It's like you find all these articles that say something just close enough to what the point is you want to make, and you put it together as a puzzle. And I like the puzzle. I find it entertaining.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Modell. I'm at North Shore University Hospital at Northwell Health in New York. I'm a simulation educator there. As far as grants, one thing that I'm excited about is, many of us, have successes and failures when we're going through like the grant application process. And a silver lining for me has been that, despite not receiving certain grants, like kind of reworking your aims, your topic, or maybe finding the right sponsor. I think, as long as you put in a little bit of work and you're able to do that, you usually can find something, or at least in my experience, I've been able to find something that's been able to get me funding. So.
Hi guys, Thomas Yang here. I'm from the Medical College of Wisconsin. I'm a simulation person like Tiffany and Dr. Wong. Ambrose here, actually, former simulation fellow there. Actually got my interest about research through him, so I actually want to give him a little kudos through Ambrose. I do simulation education research at the Medical College of Wisconsin. I'm also an APD for the residency program there. I would say my favorite thing about grant writing, as I have learned for the past few years, is that actually same thing. I love making the argument for myself. I actually love the technical part of writing, which is actually something I did not know until I started writing for the grant for myself. The one thing I hate about grants is getting shut down and getting rejected all the time, and it just puts me down, but hopefully the resilience and the grit kind of like keep me going. So that's the one thing I just do not like about grant writing, is like, okay, I'm probably gonna get rejected, but just gotta keep pushing. Finding the internal motivation has been helpful too, through mentors and stuff, so.
Hi all, Mike Gottlieb at Rush in Chicago. I'm the Olson Division Director and the Vice Chair of Research out there. My favorite part about grant writing, I'm gonna say it's getting funded. That seems like the best part, when they say, hey, I'm gonna give you money. That was awesome. But outside of that, I'm a constant learner. Like, I like to approach things that have something new I can learn and grow in. And so as someone who kind of transitioned from medical education into research and then into grants personship, that ability to start to learn a new skill, to be able to learn the new language of this, and to grow with great, amazing collaborators has been a really fun process. So as much as it does lead to a lot of things that end up being not funded and a small percentage that do, The amount I learned from each direction has been really incredible, so I've enjoyed it regardless.
Holly Credawire, Stanford. I think my favorite part about grants is pragmatically being able to repurpose my entire grant for my IRB and my paper. Because I feel like if you're going to do all that work, it may as well count for as many things as humanly possible, and set you up for success across the board.
Hi, I'm Amy Hildreth. I'm also at the Uniformed Services University. I'm the Emergency Medicine Clerkship Director there. I think my favorite part, other than all of the great things that have been mentioned, I like assembling a team and figuring out who's going to be able to work well with me on the project and what areas that I need more help with to pull in. I think my least favorite part is that first blank application and trying to just get started from the beginning with nothing.
All right, thanks, guys. So the panel is here for you all, so if you have any questions at any time, feel free to jump in and you can ask them. These are my disclosures, and then today we are going to talk about why we really need grant funding within medical education. We're going to talk about what are the parts of an application that you'll need to work through, and then we'll give you a list of available funding resources, and you have that in your packet as well to take with you.
I think when we talk about why do we need grants, it's really important that we're doing high quality medical education research, and it's really hard to do great high quality research without funding and without money. I think the pandemic has shown that we really need to make sure that we are finding the most effective ways to teach and the best things to do, and just like everything else in the world, you need money to get it done. It's hard, but it's worth it when it works out well.
Okay, so we're going to share some strategies for success. So the first one is the top of the list for a reason. So if you can find a good mentor, I think everything else will kind of come into place. Could be somebody at your university, at another university. SAEM has some great resources. I just went through the ARM MedEd program where they gave me a mentor, which is really nice benefit of that. For the panel, how did you all find your mentor? How did that happen? Anybody have a good example of that?
I mean, I'm happy to say I will say I stalked her. I don't think she would say that necessarily. So I met Lainey Uris, who was at the time the program director at OHSU when I was a resident in Wisconsin. And we just had a lot of shared interests, and I became her education fellow. Learned absolutely everything I possibly could from her, and her successes and failures and all of the lessons that she's learned over the years in applying for grants, and the way that she thinks, which is definitely different than how I do, which I think has been super helpful. You don't need someone who thinks exactly like you, has the same interests as you, anything like that necessarily. It's just someone who really you can connect with and get that level of expertise and advice from that you trust. And now we collaborate on pretty much every single project that I do. And that's been just an incredibly rich and wonderful partnership.
So when you're thinking about who's going to be your mentor, I think you have to look at a couple of different elements. One is you need to find someone who will be critical of their feedback. There's a lot of people that mentor you, be like, good job, and give you positive feedback, and hey, that looks really cool, and here's a couple of minor comments. You need the person who will redline your entire grant. You need the person who's going to shred it so it's better. And so kind of seeking out that person who is comfortable and you have that comfortable relationship for them to be able to just completely open it up and make it more red than, more red ink than black ink on your application is normal, that's healthy, that's how it should be. So having that conversation and kind of normalizing that this should be like something where you're soliciting active feedback. One of my mentors is Bob Weinstein, so speaking to, the diversity of interest, he's an infectious disease specialist. I kind of wedged my way in over the course of about 4 years, and got him as one of the mentors, and he's been phenomenal at that. But the other thing you want to think about, and this may or may not be your mentor, is someone who will sponsor you. And a grant sponsor is a little bit of a different scenario. You need someone that will bring you into grants, because the expectation generally with grants is that you have a trajectory coming in. And if you don't have a trajectory coming in, they don't want to fund you. But if you can't get funded, how do you build a trajectory? And it's this weird cycle of like, well, how do I get funded? Because I don't have this background. Well, you'll get funded when you get this background. Okay, so how do I get funded to this? Well, you need to be funded. It creates a cycle. And so you need someone that's going to let you kind of ride their coattails a little bit to pull you into grants, to give you that trajectory, to show you like, okay, now you've done this, and then you take the reins. And so that's a lot different in grants personship than I think you see in like other applications where we see it, where you can probably get there a lot easier on your own merit of that. It's a lot more common in grants. And so trying to find that person who will let you kind of build, not only learn the skill set, but also help you kind of join onto there to build that track record, makes you more competitive when you go after stuff on your own.
Yeah, I totally agree what Holly and Mike have said so far. I would say if you are having difficulty finding a mentor at your institution, I think it's the best to find one through your institution. Again, as Mike had said, his mentor is an infectious disease doctor, so he's not an EM person. I sometimes leverage like interest groups, academies, committees, and someone who can just, hey, have a conversation or email, say, hey, like I think we share some same interest. You know, can I just talk to you? Can I just run this by you regarding it? I think that's another informal way of reaching and finding a mentorship or sponsor through that. And who knows, it's all about networking. You start somewhere and you'll get there. And I've utilized that a few times regarding that. So that's another thing I would add.
Yeah, I'll echo what everyone has said so far. For me, my mentors have been at my home institutions. I've been fortunate enough to have people who've had like very similar research and medical education interests as me. So I've been able to partner with them. They've sponsored me and given me opportunities not only to be on grants with them, but also to start with smaller projects that kind of help get you your own credibility, so that when you go and you apply for your own grant as your own PI, it kind of like bolsters you and your reputation and your application as well. And these mentors, they'll serve with you when you're applying for your own grant, because you always need somebody who's a little bit more senior than you, to show your sponsor that you're going to be successful in administering and doing running your project.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add to that is, because I started with internal funding, and that's how I learned how to write a grant, so it was a little bit less competitive than federal funding or National Academy funding. And the problem I had was coming from an institution that's not a big academic site. We had people that had done a little bit of grants and had research experience, but not at all in med ed, had simulation experience. I was writing a grant on airway simulation. Didn't have device experience. I had to find that outside. So multiple mentors for the different aspects of your grant is what I found was really helpful. They have different lenses. They have different opinions. But it really did give me the advice and the skill sets that I needed.
One thing that comes to mind for me in terms of thinking about medical education grants, but really being successful medical education scholarship, is actually seeking mentorship and collaborators outside of medicine. And it doesn't even necessarily, it could be outside your department, but I think, especially in med ed, we have a lot of overlap with social sciences, psychology, sociology, and some of those folks are actually some of the best qualitative researchers or some of the best methodologically for anything from developing surveys or psychometrics, and they have written PhDs and written multiple papers on it. It may not just be in medical education, but they can be really great mentors to help you think about how to hone the methods and how to write the methods properly.
All right, just checking in. Any questions from the audience yet? Okay. So the next strategy for success is to adjust to a new type of writing. So this happened to me with my mentor, that I quickly figured out with all the redlining that writing a grant is not the same as writing a paper for a journal. There's a special way of stringing along your audience as you kind of build your point and your argument. And every single word counts. Like, it's very technical and specific. So finding someone who can help you learn how to do that is really important, and practicing it. And I think the more grants that you read, you'll start to notice a difference between the flow and the feel of that compared to like reading a journal article. Another strategy that you could do is to volunteer for panels. So I know all the federal grants are always looking for volunteer reviewers, and there's probably lots of local places. Maybe even at your university, local university, you can volunteer there. So the more you do that, and the more that you're reading grants and looking at them with a kind of a technical, critical eye, the better it makes you prepared to write your own grant. And then identifying an appropriate funding agency. So this is super important because you could write the best grant in the world, spend all this time doing it, spend months, and then you submit it to a sponsor who's not really interested in your topic, or your topic isn't aligning to what they're looking for. So that's where your mentor can come in, talking to people. If you can contact the agency or the sponsor and have a conversation with them at the beginning with a program officer, that can be really helpful in making sure you're not doing a lot of work for nothing. Any advice on that end from you all about finding the right place to submit?
I was going to, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
The only thing I was going to add is finding the right agency is important, but there is also some packaging involved with your grant. You could pretty much write the same grant, but just package it in different ways from multiple agencies. So I think the important thing is actually identifying what the funding agency wants and what their priorities are. And then, I mean, some of it is really outside the scope, in which case then it's not the right fit. But I think thinking a little bit about what your science is trying to ask and can it be applied at all in line with what they want is actually one way to streamline it so that you're kind of fitting that agency.
Yeah. What we ended up doing is, just to give you like how I adjusted it to what the agency wanted, was the last grant we submitted was for a time and motion study. I wanted to look at clinical workflow patterns. That's what I wanted to know. The grants foundation did not want to know that. They wanted to understand why we're so burnt out. Because the work report had just come out, EM was the most burnt out specialty. So they were interested in that information. So I partnered with somebody who does wellness, and we looked at both. And we looked at correlations between clinical workflow patterns and resiliency and burnout. And do burned out physicians interact differently when they're at work? And they loved it. But it spoke to exactly what they wanted to know, which they wanted to know, why are we so burned out and what's going on with that? And it gave me all the data I needed to answer the informatics question of how are we using the EMR. And so I could get what I wanted out of it, but they could also get their aims. And so we adjusted the aims, essentially, for their wants.
So one of the other things I keep in mind here is that there's only so many med-ed grants that are out there, right? We have a set amount. If you think about, you have this pie and there's only so much, slices in there, and everyone takes slices out, and there's only so much there. So how do we expand the pie? How do we open up more slices, more opportunities for this? And I think we sometimes focus on the only lens of this being, okay, I'm going to focus on mine being the primary sole focus of this project. And exactly, excellent points that were brought forward is how you tailor to the grant. But I also think about how we can be the collaborator. We bring in this med-ed background that allows us to implement trials, that allows us to train up people. And so there's also roles to join into grants as a co-I, where you're the person that helps to enact actually the training within the program evaluation and use implementation science and use thoughtful principles to ensure that it's actually going to be successful. Because all is well in theory, but if you have no plan to actually implement your study or to ensure people actually follow it through well and they're trained appropriately on there, and that use good survey design methods for if there's a survey in there and all those components of it, well, then it's not going to be as successful as you want. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to partner up with areas that are like pure basic sciences and bring the education lens in, or the qualitative lens in, or the implementation science lens in to add value, get time, and then use that to burrow into your next round of funding too.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one more stuff is when you look for the funding agency and the call for applications, I mean, Ambrose and Anne-Marie had made great points to tailor towards what you want. Really read through what they're asking for, because what you may think you're applying for that funding, it may be different than what they're asking for. So it's very important to read through every single word, understanding what they're asking for, And again, as Rebecca said, it's a technicality how you write it, and make sure you write in what they're asking for. It's also found it very important when I got my grant rejected with all the good feedback and the comments that I've got from the reviewers.
I think the other piece of this is not just the content of the grant, but the scope. Because you'll have funding agencies that want to fund innovation. You'll have funding agencies that want to fund research. You have funding agencies that want informatics, AI. Think about that piece, but also think about the duration of the grant. I think a lot of people often neglect this and think, I'm going to write this massive grant, which is, yes, 5 to 10 years worth of research for a 1 to 2 year funding opportunity. And I see this mistake very frequently. So think about right-sizing the scope of your grant. I was told time and again in my master's program, small is beautiful. And I've really taken that to heart because I am someone who likes to write big grants. But packaging things in such a way that you are scoping and right-sizing the grant for the time that is available for exactly what it is they're trying to fund, both from a content perspective, what the call is actually for, but also the type. Because you'll look at some of these AMA grants and they want innovation. You look at the SAEM grants, they explicitly want research. So thinking about how you're coming at the presentation of your aims and what your deliverables are is going to be really important.
And so I absolutely love that. I'm gonna have one more comment on the scope or how you align it. Have you ever been on shift and you give feedback to a resident, you've given them like 3 rounds of feedback, and at the end of the shift, they're like, no one give me feedback, right? All right, I'm seeing the nod, right? Grants agencies feel the same way. Someone puts their grants in there, they're like, they don't even care what I care about. And you're like, yes, I do. I'm telling you exactly what you want. And they don't see the alignment. And so the same way that you would signpost feedback and be like, let's give some feedback now, and then to be like, oh yeah, this happened, okay. Like I understood it happened, but to make sure that the other person kind of recognizes this was happening in the moment, you want to signpost for your granting agencies. So they'll tell you, they're like, we're interested in this. And for MedEd particularly, when we step outside the MedEd sphere and we try to apply something that is MedEd relevant, like exactly in the case of, for example, burnout, and you're like, well, this seems perfectly aligned to me, and they're like, this has nothing to do with what we're interested in, it's signposting. I basically take the exact same thing they're looking for and say, and this aligns with improving our blank, 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 blank. And I just align it, and I bold it, and I italicize it, and I underline it, and if I could make it in yellow, I'd make it in yellow. And I would make it as clear as possible that I'm like, here, see, this is happening right now. This is feedback to you right now happening in the moment. I signpost it. So the more that you can call out and say, like, this is how well it's aligned, the more explicit. You have to assume most grant readers, with the exception of the people who are actually just diving into this, will quickly flip through it in minutes before they actually have to do it. It's like cramming for a test. You only remember certain things. The things that are bold you do. So you want to be like, oh yeah, okay, this one did align. Okay, cool, check.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. One thing I also wanted to mention was that when you're trying to figure out which specific grant to apply to, in addition to looking at their aims and their objectives and what they're looking for, I think Rebecca mentioned it, but you can reach out to the program officer. You can send them a statement, like a goal statement of what your goals and objectives of your project are, and they can give you the feedback. Yes, this is in line with something that we'd want to sponsor. No, this is not the right venue for this. And just having that feedback can help you, direct or redirect your efforts. Let's say if you want to look for another sponsor to apply to. Also wanted to mention, for a project that my team got funding for, for example, we applied to a couple of different funding sources. The ones that were the less lucrative ones we got rejected from, but the more lucrative ones we ended up getting. And the bottom line, the reason why that happened was that our goals and objectives were very much aligned with the goals and objectives of the sponsor. So. Like everyone mentioned, that's super important. And if you find a sponsor that is, wants to fund exactly what you're doing, definitely go for it. But then again, you can always tweak your objectives to meet their needs as well.
All right. So the last piece of advice that we have is to try again. So rejection is just part of the process. The good thing about when you get rejected is you get some feedback. So I kind of make it a policy that I wait a period of time before I do read that feedback, like let the emotional wave kind of pass, and then I have someone else read it first and have them give me a summary of it, and then I go read it myself, so I'm, prepared. But if you do all that and let yourself process, it can be so good. The feedback can be so good. Some people spend a lot of time thinking through your application, and they can really help you because most likely you're going to submit it again somewhere. So hey, now you got a whole nother set of outside eyes on it from experts, and it can make it all that much better. How do anybody else deal with rejection in a different way than I do that you found to be helpful?
It's not if at first you don't succeed, it's when at first you don't succeed. And that's very healthy that you have something, you don't look at it right away and you have someone else. I look at it right away. Look at it right away. I read through all of it. I get very angry that they didn't get it. And then I'm like, wait, they didn't get it probably because I didn't write it clearly enough. But I have this staged approach. So it's kind of like the stages of grief, right? Like you read it, you get angry, and then you walk away for a couple of days, and you allow yourself a couple of days to mope. I think it's it is grieving, right? You give yourself a couple of days to be like, that one didn't work out. I get to be sad and eat ice cream and all of this other stuff.
I didn't want to do it with them anyways, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then you go back to it. And I feel like at that point, 7 days later-ish, you can really have that reflective, okay, here's what I wrote, here's what resonated, here's what didn't, here's how I would change this grant going forward. And even if you don't reapply for a grant with the same project, in all likelihood, you are probably going to move forward with that project in some way, shape, or form. So that feedback is still helpful for what you're going to do. And I think for me, it makes your work better to apply for grants because it's basically getting feedback for free. And I love good free feedback on my work. And so, you have that to go and say, well, now I apply for the IRB, I start doing the project, I think through all of these things, and it helps your methodology, it helps you be a much clearer writer, it helps the project evolve, all of those things. So I think it's just get the rage out, do what you need to do, give yourself a few days to process, and then really just dive back in and be like, you know what, this is actually a gift. I am going to use this to its maximal benefit.
And rejection is normal. We should start with that. Let's just normalize that. Yeah. In grants world particularly, it's very, very common. They say that it's around 10% is the success rate. So if you're putting all the time and effort into it and you're getting 9 failures for every success, you're doing great. You're doing exactly what you should be. It's normal. They always get rejected all the time. The thing that's a little bit unique about grants versus papers, if my paper gets rejected, I'm just going to keep throwing it at the wall for a while unless it's truly, truly failure, and I'll get it in somewhere. If my grant's rejected, I'll actually get some feedback on the feedback. And I'll pull someone who's external to the project who does not have a vested interest and tell me, is this a fatal flaw or is this a revamp? Now, sometimes the granting agency will kind of give you that hint. They'll put you near they'll be like, oh, the funding threshold is, so for grants, low scores are better. And you'll be like, funding threshold is 21, you got a 30. You're like, that's going to be fundable in the future. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the threshold is 21 and you got a 99. And you're like, okay, that's a really bad score. We're not even going what they call is triage. They typically won't even score it because they're like, it's so off the wall, we're not going to do it. And they get this range between. And so anything in that range between, I get feedback. And the thing that's, again, unique about this is, it's not like you're on the back end of the project trying to publish a paper. You're on the front end. You're going to commit to doing this project. And so what happens if you get funded with a really bad project that's not doable? That's actually a much worse state than not getting funded in the first place. Particularly if you want to get funded by the agency again. They don't super love funding people if you're unsuccessful with what you gave you the first trial of it. And so I look at this feedback to say, is this feedback I can correct, make it better? Or is this feedback that's telling me you need to shift your direction and do something differently? Either way, they make me a better grant writer. Either way, I learn from that. But it's okay to let the project kind of move aside and to do something differently because you're not investing nearly as much as if you get funded and then you're stuck with this project that you can't do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I've kind of stated in the beginning that, I hate getting rejected. The thing is, though, just like Mike said, just like reshifting the frame of thought process is okay to get rejected, but it's how you focus on the process itself. Like as Holly and Mike have stated, that you get really detailed feedback on when you get rejected from the grant, and the more I read about it, I know that I'm getting better because my scores are getting better, but also because I feel like I'm getting one step closer to getting funded because of the scores, whatever that is. And it kind of motivates me too, and as Holly stated, it's free. It's actually really free feedback for your improvement, for your career, for research and grants, whatever it is. And so I hate getting rejected, but I love getting free feedback. And I just love the process of me improving myself as a researcher. I think it really motivates me. And I totally second to Holly and Rebecca's comment that I read first, I get very angry. And I think I need about like 2 weeks or something, read again. And I'm like, okay, now I need to I can step forward, I can move forward with that and tailor towards something that I can apply again with the same project or something different, so.
I was going to echo what you guys all said. I think normalizing rejection, but also normalizing the emotional reaction to the rejection is also very key, meaning that you feel bad and it sucks because you put all this life, blood and sweat and tears into this for a couple of months, and then they're like, nah, not good enough. And you're like, I spent months writing all this crap. And just even talking to very senior investigators who write big, big grants, and hearing them also feel very personally hurt by rejection made me feel better, because they say, okay, also very seasoned investigators who've also themselves gotten funded, but it's also very difficult to receive that type of rejection. And I think it's okay to give yourself some time. I think some of my mentors said that they really do. They look at it and then they actually give themselves a little break just to kind of grief and process the emotion. I think that's actually really valuable. The other thing I was gonna mention is I think the try again might be slightly nuanced depending on sort of how much experience and expertise you have in grant writing overall, but also that particular type of grant. I think at the beginning, when you're very new to grants altogether, it can be very daunting, and sometimes you can shoot completely in the dark or not be right. And I think in that particular instance, having a mentor who's written grants is really key, because they'll give you some feedback about is there some sort of logistical problem with the way you put the grant together? Is it the science? Is it the scope? Because sometimes it could be a number of different things. Once you become more experienced and have tried one grant or two, and then you're getting some rejections, then it's more like, well, is it the right fit? Maybe it's near funding, but not quite. I need to do some adjustment, or should I just give up altogether? But I think when you shift to a whole different type of grant, either it's a foundation you haven't worked with before, or you're trying for something that's in a field that you're not familiar with, that can be basically starting you back from scratch, because you're shooting in the dark again. And so in that particular instance, again, finding people who've written grants in that area or have gotten funding in that area can really help you to decide if you should try again or shift gears altogether.
Does anyone have any questions at this point about any of these things? Yeah?
I have a question. And this is more, I'm sorry, Jeremy Boyd, Vanderbilt. So this is a little bit, let's say 1 in a million, let's say you get the grant. So administration of grants, because this is, you're in many ways resource within your department. You're also relying on the administrative resources, and you're competing potentially against clinical trial support and things like that. So how have y'all navigated the administrative kind of component of managing the grant when you've gotten it? Just love to hear y'all talk about that.
You want to start?
Sure. So nobody in this room is okay. I will say the first grant I got was still ongoing, thank God, but not well managed up front. And I think that was because our department very clearly has the infrastructure for clinical trials and health services research and that kind of stuff. That's what they're used to. They're used to the federal funding mechanism. They're not necessarily used to foundation funding. And so, a lot of it falls to you as an investigator and or your support people and or a mentor in the department to have kind of this come to Jesus conversation with your grants team to say, I got this funding. I know it doesn't look the same as all of the other funding that you've managed previously. It doesn't come with all the indirects, da 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 da. However, like, the budget still needs to be managed. We can't defraud the funder. You need to make sure that there is operational support, at least for budget management. The part that you can handle is oftentimes, and this is the best advice I've ever gotten, some of the best, is for you to either write into your grant or get the department to agree to, before you submit the grant, if I am successful, I will have project management administrative support. That has saved me more times than I can count. And that is probably the most important thing, because that person will help manage the day-to-day of your grant, depending upon what it is, enrolling subjects, scheduling interviews if you're doing qualitative work. That's most of the chaos of my grants. And they will also submit and work with all of the budgeting. So they get to have the day-to-day harassment relationship with the budget folks of like, okay, whether it's within your department or the university proper, of here's how the funds flow is going to work, here's how I'm going to submit things, here's, the SPOs and all the things and how it needs to be managed, here's how often we're going to check in. If it's multiple grants, if you get to the point where you have multiple, you should be sitting down at least quarterly with the person who manages your money and your project manager to be like, are the funds flowing where they're supposed to be flowing? What does this look wonky? How do we fix this? Why am I being charged indirects when I'm not supposed to? Like, things like that, because they will happen. So you have to be on top of it, but also having a second set of eyes as a project manager will help. And then again, having mentors or other people in your department who can help you to help wrangle your budget folks, because that is the hardest part, is like, where's the money going? When is the money going? And how do I account for the money? Because you have to be responsible to the funder who gave you the money. And I will say that can be the most exhausting thing in the world, when all you want to do is do the research you just got paid to do, right? Like, you're so excited, you're like, I got the grant. And then like 3 months in, you're like, wait a second. Where is all the money going? Is it going to the right person? Why are you charging me that? Like, it's all sorts of chaos. And I think it just takes some education and love and attention and sweat, tears, nightmares, all of that fun stuff.
I think a lot of it's the pre-planning too. Before you get the grant, you have to try to understand as much as you can about every nuance and for that funding mechanism. So for example, if you're doing something with an industry, where do the indirects come off of? Does the same indirect model apply? Are there, IRB fees? Are there, if you're doing a multi-site study, is there a single IRB fee? Like, understanding every single thing that potentially could be in the budget, get it in before you submit your grant. That will save you any kind of budgetary, or reduce the risk of budgetary issues on the back end. But also know what you have. So for context, I'm probably, I am the most funded person in my department, but I'm like one of the only funded people in my department. So as opposed to, I'm going to do the contrary of Stanford, where it's a haven of people who've done a lot of funding. I came in and they're like, I haven't seen this before for a lot of things. And so figure out who you can go to ask if you're at a site where there isn't that infrastructure, or there isn't that infrastructure for a similar type of grant. And so for our site, what I learned was, in addition to hiring my own project manager for things, thank you, grant funding, but separate from that is deciding, like, for example, early on when I was getting smaller funds is, I can't hire a project manager with a smaller grant. So what can I do? Things I learned over time that may be helpful for you as well. One is that most institutions have shared supports. So ours is called Research Assistant Shared Support, or RAS. And basically we'll reach out to them and they will contract a certain amount of services for a small cost. So rather than me hiring a grants manager for somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 a year, I can buy time at an hourly rate for the small amount of time I need. So that's an option. The other thing I learned is that at a certain threshold, the institution doesn't really care about indirects. So if I have a $10,000 grant and I'm worried about having to pay indirects on that, I just tell them, listen, this study won't even run without this small amount of money, or IRB fees. They gave me $10,000 IRB fees on a $10,000 grant. I was like, I'm sorry, that's not going to work. And if I tried to do it over email, I don't think it would have worked. But when I talked to them over the phone, I was like, listen, this is a really meaningful study. This is what brings into our institution. Can we waive the IRB fees? And they're like, oh yeah, no problem, that's fine. And so I got costs that were supposedly set in stone removed over a simple conversation explaining how it really wasn't meaningful to the institution and the grant was more meaningful. And so just knowing that a phone call makes a big difference, understand where your support is, and plan in advance makes a big difference.
I was just going to add two pieces in response to your question. I think the first thing is, I think Mike alluded to this, but as an investigator, as a researcher, you do need to invest time to learn a little bit of the administrative tasks that are very different from running the science. And so there is a whole new language that's going to be very novel to you when you actually get a grant in terms of what does an indirect cost mean, how do you fund a PhD student, you have to fund their tuition, and each institution has their own nuances. And so it's going to be really daunting up front, and sometimes you learn as you go because sometimes new rules come up, or you're like, this is something we haven't dealt with before. But working with collaborators or mentors who've administered grants in your department, or even other departments, are really going to help you figure that out in advance. I think that's the first thing. It just takes work. You actually do have to learn it, unfortunately. Because I think learning it up front is going to save you pain down the line, but also get you to be more successful and actually be able to maximize the use of your funds. For example, in medic grants, they're going to be smaller funds, but they're going to make a big difference for you as a medical educator because it's going to free up your time, it's going to make the science more rigorous, and so you just don't want to waste the money because it's going to be gold for you to either apply for another grant or make the paper really great. And then the other thing is, I think you have to think a little bit about your institution, which Mike alluded to. Is your institution or department resource intense or rich in research or not? Because that's going to change the game in terms of how you discuss that with either your grants team or your department. So for folks that have more funding in your department, you are going to be a smaller P, so it's going to be a little hard to negotiate, but they're going to have infrastructure in place to administer grants, they're going to have accountants, they're going to have post-award teams to help you, and so that's going to save you some time. You're going to be able to learn from people who are very experienced. In a department that's going to be a lot more research poor or maybe not as familiar with it, they're going to learn the process as you go, and so you may have to take a little more ownership over guiding the process with them. And so then you have to do a little bit more research up front to make sure that you're doing that successfully because it may be the first time they've ever done this type of thing.
Yeah, I actually add one more thing on top of it. And I'm still doing this, when I initially apply for a grant, give yourself a lot of time to prepare and understand the language and have multiple meetings with a grants contracts officer if you have one in your institution. Actually helped me a lot. You're going to have to develop a budget. Yeah, I mean, not yourself, but with the budget person, and you have to understand the language as they just talked about. And when I first applied for a grant, I mean, it just took me a lot of time just for meetings to understand what this means, how I can even allocate this fund to this fund to that. And there's technicality of that for each different funding of the grant that there is. And so give yourself enough time and have multiple meetings until you understand what that means about that grant. I think they will help. And as Ambrose and other experts are also here, and I think over time it just comes more natural, and then you just kind of understand what they're talking about. But in the beginning, if you're a junior person like I am, I give myself way enough time to prepare the packaging of the grant application and to make sure that I understand the language of the application too.
And on the grant support, one thing you can do is go to your grant support staff, find out whose grants are coming off and funding's going away for grant support administrators that are around. And if you're applying to something that lines up, then you have a skilled person that already can kind of take the role that's already onboarded. It really leads to a lot of decreasing ramp-up time. And I found so much easier to get a grant started when we identified somebody ahead of time, got them up to snuff, but while we were actually submitting the grant. And they just happen to have the right timeline to support it. And so and then it's also a little easier sometimes if you're only partially funding them, if there's already somebody in place that you then don't have to fully fund them. And to that point, with the funding, we were able to adjust the budget, and so that you can kind of move things around when you actually get that person identified and you get their salary identified, to move money from one bucket to another. So there was plenty of money to support the right person. We just decreased the amount of money we were spending on some of the hard equipment for cheaper equipment so that we could afford her.
All right. So this is the pretty much standard anatomy for a grant. And in your packet, there are some sample aims. There's a sample bio sketch there for you to take a look at. So I would highly recommend, no matter where you are in this stage, that you look for a course in grant funding. So I took one. I've taken like 2 right now that are like year-long courses. In the courses, you'll go through each of these different parts, and they'll have you, pick a project, and then you kind of write each of these parts for that and get feedback and get peer feedback. So that's been super helpful for me. Just in the time that we have left, I'm going to ask Holly. I think the most important place on this list is the aims, and that's probably where you want to start when you're writing your grant. So she's really developed an expertise in this, and she's the one that wrote the sample ones in your packet. If you just want to share a little bit about writing aims.
So, agree. This is probably the most important part of your grant because this is the part that everyone's going to read. I can tell you the vast majority of people who read your grants will read your first page, and that's it. That's it. They will read like your background paragraph, the like research question, like why should you care about this? Your 3 aims, and then like done. They will not read anything else. So this page is imperative to convey why someone should care about funding you. And the way I like to set this up is the same way I set up a paper. It is your problem gap hook. So what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What is the gap in the literature? Why do you care? And to Mike's point, if you have to bold it, do it. Why funders should you care about this? Here, broadly, is the question I'm trying to answer. Be it I'm trying to solve, whatever this complex problem is, and this is going to be kind of, a program of research for the next 1 to however many years the grant is funded for. Here are the 3 aims. And I write my aims in a way that is probably different than a lot of people do. You're laughing at me. I write the aim, and then basically I give the methodologic approach that I'm going to use to address the aim. Because again, if they're not reading anything past the first page, I want them to know that I have these aims, and here's how I'm going to pull them off. By the end of this study, here's the problem, here's the gap, here's why you should care, here's my broad research question, here are the 3 things I'm going to do, here's how I'm going to do them. By the time they're at the end of the first page, I want them to believe fully that I can do exactly what I'm telling them I can do. If you can accomplish that, I think that is 90-some-odd% of the battle. And I will say these are all for very different grants. Sample 2 is probably like the first grant I ever wrote, and is for the most funding and did get funded, and is for a 5-year grant. So it's big, right? Big grant. Sample 3 is for a 1-year grant, much smaller. It reads like more than 1 year. So again, I made the mistake that someone still was crazy enough to give me money. The front page, I have no idea what's going to happen because it's under review right now. But they're all for very different funding sources for very different agencies. The first one's for ABMS, second one is for the American Medical Association, and the third one is SAEM. For very different funding sources, very different projects, and just take very different approaches. But I do think if you, again, mission critical can convince someone by the end of the first page of exactly what you're trying to do and why they should care about it, and the fact that you can pull off what you want to do in the time frame they've given you and why it aligns with what they care about, you've won. The rest of the grant is just fluff from there. Yes, obviously you have to flesh out all of the other things and be very detailed because, anywhere from 2 to 4 people will read your entire grant in depth, but the vast majority of people will just read that first page. And that first page ought to be killer. So that's just my hot tips. I'm sure everyone else up here has very different ways of doing things, given that Mike over here is cackling about my aims.
No, I'll put I completely agree, and I think that the tailoring. I appreciate that you now have an example of 3 really well-written aims from someone who's been very successful in this in medical education. I would add on a couple of caveats. One is that know the rules. So specific aims pages have a very distinct format. Now there are some grants that have differences and that they can vary, but most specific aims pages follow a very specific format. If you look up, it's academic emergency medicine. Monty and Libby. They did a paper that was like an anatomy of specific games. It's like 3 or 4 pages. It's basically a guideline telling you exactly what to do. My first grant when I did, it actually got funded. I don't know why they decided to fund me, but I got funded from Core DMF, and I put in the specific games page, and it was 2 specific games just listed with nothing. It was like, oh, specific games 1, bolded. Specific games 2, bolded. And that was it. It was like 2 lines on a page.
It was the bold.
I think the project was cool.
It's the bold that got you.
Yeah, it was the bold. I was like, please fund me. But I didn't know what I was doing. So I just put this in. I was like, oh, specific games. Of course, here are my specific games. I moved on. And subsequently, obviously, I've learned the difference. But there is an anatomy, like a very discrete understanding of like what needs to be in there. And the more you align with it, the more likely you'll be funded. The other thing I'll put in there is, remember, the person reviewing this is not you. They're not the expert in this content arena. They may not be emergency medicine. They may not be medical education. They may be coming from an extremely different background. I've done some grants in from community health, and these are patients who are reading this. So assume that the person there does not have your content expertise. You need to demonstrate simultaneously that you know the literature, you are the expert in this area, and at the same time that you can explain this to a 5th grader. And here is the best use of ChatGPT, is you literally put it in there and you say, write it like a 5th grader. Now, you're not going to copy paste that, because every single sentence will start off with leveraging the content of medical education, leveraging this, leveraging that. So you're not going to copy it in there, but it will. If you look side by side, you'll start to identify the changes, and you're like, oh wow, that was a much simpler way of explaining this. Now I'll put it in my own words, or I'll put the caveat and say, identify the things that are at the level above a 5th grader, and tell me where I should make changes, and then you keep the change in your own language. So I actually really like to use ChatGPT, not to copy paste, because I think it will not come out well, but to identify where I'm writing something that's overly technical, overly abbreviated, at too high of a level of knowledge, and then people definitely won't get it.
Yeah, I would say one more thing to add is when you write your page, and as Mike had stated, the people who may be reviewing your application is not in emergency medicine or medicine in general. I actually have 3 to 5, I should send it to 3 to 5 people to read them, one could be emergency medicine, one could be just medicine in general, one could be just PhD in something. I just try to send it to most 3 to 5 individuals who can give me feedback to see if they really understand what I'm talking about. Has helped in the past.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I also married a PhD, R01 funded scientist. So I just, he's contracted in. That's what the ring's for.
All right. Thank you all very much for coming, at least for the next 8 minutes. The panel will be here if you have any questions. But good luck to everyone. Try again.